Hi, I'm Lilay. Today we're going to talk about this book, Pride and Prejudice. This is obviously a classic. It was officially published in 1813 and has been popular for over 200 years. The cover of this edition says, "A guide to love and marriage for young people. I will always be true to myself, running towards you day and night." Pretty inspiring, right? So why does this story still feel so fresh after all these years? Maybe it's because it reflects our reality. When I run towards you day and night, where is that person? Where should I go to find them? Secondly, when you reach a certain age and people around you start pushing you to get married, what do you do if that person hasn't shown up yet? Thirdly, when we choose to enter into a relationship and marriage, do we value feelings more or wealth more? Fourthly, if everyone disapproves of your relationship and your parents are against it, how should you handle it? In Pride and Prejudice, all these dramatic scenarios actually happen. So what kind of story does Pride and Prejudice tell? It takes place in a small town in late 18th and early 19th century England. Mr. Bennet is a middle-class man with 5 beautiful daughters, all of whom are at the age to start thinking about marriage, but their personalities and choices are completely different. The book is called Pride and Prejudice, and you can think of it as referring to 2 people. Who are they? Pride is Mr. Darcy, the rich and handsome CEO, while Prejudice is Elizabeth, the second daughter of Mr. Bennet. Let's talk about these 5 girls. Their lives were originally very peaceful, but one day the wealthy Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley suddenly appeared in town, causing a stir among these 5 girls who are about to talk about marriage. As the story progresses, we see the elegant, reserved, and very beautiful eldest daughter, Jane, the town's belle, falls in love with Mr. Bingley at first sight. However, this town belle doesn't know how to express her feelings, leading Mr. Bingley to be unsure if she has fallen in love with him. Then we see the second daughter, Elizabeth, our main heroine. She is smart, independent, and has a strong will. She and Mr. Darcy are a perfect match. But because of pride, he can't fall in love with her. And because of prejudice, she can't fall in love with him. They have many entanglements. Meanwhile, the other girls are either passionate, a bit old-fashioned, or a little lost. They all yearn to love and be loved, but often lose themselves. Faced with their mother's varied methods of pushing for marriage, how will these girls take charge of their own love and destiny? This is the most important thread in the book. So, how influential is Pride and Prejudice? We all know that the British writer Maugham, who is both smart and sharp-tongued, included Pride and Prejudice in his list of the top 10 novels in the world. American literary critics have said that in the past 100 years, there have been several revolutions in taste in the history of British literature. Works that were once highly praised were later cast aside. However, only 2 have remained ever popular: Shakespeare and Jane Austen, the author of Pride and Prejudice. This means that in the eyes of critics, this female author is on par with Shakespeare. How high is Jane Austen's status? On the 200th anniversary of her death, the Bank of England officially issued a new $10 note featuring her portrait and a quote from Pride and Prejudice. So, when you get this bill, you will find it says, "I declare after all there is no enjoyment like reading." Since Pride and Prejudice was officially published, it has been constantly adapted into films or TV series, making the domineering CEO, Mr. Darcy, the dream lover of the whole England. So this story can be simply summarized as, the bossy CEO falls in love with me. The heroine who is loved is Elizabeth, the grandmother of Mary Sue stories. When I say this, a colleague asks, "What is a Mary Sue?" Let's briefly explain. There's a famous work called Star Trek. In 1973, someone spoofed it and did a recreation. They created a perfect female character who could do anything, accidentally coming to Earth, using her talents to save all of humanity. She captured the love of all men with her beauty and charm. Everyone who saw her loved her. More commendably, this girl was very pure, and in the end, she didn't waver between the male protagonists. After saving the world, she died very sadly. This heroine's name was Mary Sue. Since this work became popular, the term Mary Sue spread. It refers to those who are particularly charming, with an unknown aura and appeal, but as long as a man appears, he will fall in love with her. For example, in Scarlet Heart, all the princes love Liu Shishi, or in The Journey of Flower, or in Wei Zifu, and even in the sentence, "The sister is so Sue," there are Mary Sue type heroines all over. But why is Pride and Prejudice regarded as the grandmother of Mary Sue? Because the heroine Elizabeth in this novel is very different from the Mary Sue heroines in today's popular culture. She is not narcissistic. So why did I choose this book to talk about? I have my own perspective. Among so many novels about love, this one stands out. For example, regarding marriage, readers of this book must remember one sentence. A marriage only based on money is ridiculous, but a marriage without considering money is foolish. You'd nod in agreement, right? About love. This book says, not all of us will have romance. This means love requires some luck and some skills. It's not something you can get just because you want it. Regarding character, because of pride you can't love me, because of prejudice I can't love you. But just for these few quotes, the book wouldn't be worth talking about. I chose to discuss this book for three very important reasons. First, love is not the only theme in Pride and Prejudice. In the last third of the novel, it emphasizes the self-growth of Elizabeth, the heroine. It repeatedly poses the question, do you, as a woman, truly know who you are? Actually, the same goes for all the boys. For example, when we grow up and look at Journey to the West again, we realize that the Monkey King, Sun Wukong, is always going through self-growth. Initially, he was just a monkey born from a stone, later called that monkey. Then he was apprenticed to a master who named him Sun Wukong. Then he became the great sage equal to heaven, and finally, the victorious fighting Buddha. This is a story of personal growth. The core story of Pride and Prejudice is not love, but the growth of a woman. Secondly, many people see Pride and Prejudice as a typical Cinderella story. But her story is very different from Cinderella's. Why? Because Cinderella attracted the prince with her beauty, purity, and innocence. But Elizabeth, in addition to her appearance, has a very independent personality and spiritual dignity. She has her own clear and firm understanding of love and marriage. So when she met Prince Darcy, they first disliked each other and quarreled with each other. Then they loved and hated each other, and finally they were able to treat each other equally. What happened to the two of them? At the same time, they overcame some defects in their own personalities, crossed classes, and reaped perfect love. It sounds sweet, right? So let's put the third point today. Who should read Pride and Prejudice today? First, the love and mate selection stories of the five Bennet sisters are completely different choices. Whether in England over 200 years ago or in our current lives, the charm of a classic lies in the timeless values it conveys. Even after more than 200 years, will women living in the 21st century still experience unspeakable struggles under the pressure of their elders to marry? Will they still find various issues in mutual love and getting along with their partners? How do we find equality and mutual respect in love? When choosing marriage, do we follow the call of our hearts or succumb to reality? These issues Elizabeth faces are timeless, regardless of the era or place, always making us feel a sense of awe. So, as long as a woman wants to take control of her life, she can find inspiration in this book. There's a quote from Pride and Prejudice. People change so much that you can always find something new in them. That's the main reason for rereading this book. Now, Jane Austen, the author of Pride and Prejudice, was a legendary female writer. There's a movie called Becoming Jane, which tells her life story, and it's very moving. I'm also a novelist, so I know that every writer puts a bit of themselves into their work. The heroine of this book is Elizabeth, the second daughter of Mr. Bennet. Compared to her sisters, she isn't the prettiest, she definitely doesn't have the best personality, and she can be a bit irritable and sharp-tongued. But this girl ends up winning the love of Mr. Darcy, the most perfect gentleman in all of England. Why? Because Elizabeth has something special. This special something in Elizabeth is also a projection of Jane Austen herself. To understand this legendary author and why she's on par with Shakespeare, let's start from the beginning. In 1775, Austen was born into a clergyman's family in England. Since the 15th century, there was a rapidly developing industry in England, wool spinning. The price of wool was rising fast. Austen's family got rich from the wool business, becoming part of the gentry, which means they were middle-class landowners. By Austen's father's generation, the family's fortune had declined, and they weren't wealthy anymore. However, Austen still received a good education and was very talented. From a young age, Austen showed an exceptional talent for writing. She published 6 novels in her lifetime, and Pride and Prejudice was the first one she finished, but it wasn't the first to be published. In 1797, when Austen was in her 20s, she finished Pride and Prejudice, but it was rejected by publishers who told her she wasn't suited for novel writing. But Austen didn't give up on writing. She kept at it quietly. And in 1811, she finally published her first novel, Sense and Sensibility, which was later made into a movie by the famous director Ang Lee. Did you notice the gap? It was almost 15 years. This shows Austen had a certain quality. She was very optimistic. Even when her work was rejected, she persisted because of her passion, which is truly admirable. In 2007, a movie called Becoming Jane, starring Anne Hathaway, was released. Have you seen it before? It's very charming. Hathaway perfectly portrayed the elegant, intellectual, and slightly shy Jane Austen. So, how did she complete her writing? You have to know that in those days, women writing wasn't encouraged. In the biography Jane Austen, there's a detail about how she was very careful not to let anyone outside her family, servants or visitors, notice she was writing. She wrote on small slips of paper because they were easy to hide quickly. For instance, if the door creaked, she could instantly cover her work to keep it a secret. Jane Austen didn't actually enjoy the huge fame from her published works during her lifetime. She led a rather quiet, home life. She liked music, but wasn't very skilled at it. She spoke French and a little Italian, and was very good at needlework. Notice how needlework was a must-learn skill for women at that time, much like Yun in 6 Records of a Floating Life. Other talents weren't as important, so women's status at that time was quite low, and Austen was no exception. She spent her entire life in a very small space, with only a few familiar people around her. She never travelled far, but she had a keen sense of observation. Just listening to the gossip around her provided rich material for her novels. Jane Austen never married. She had one unsuccessful romance, no children, and lived on her brother's support. She died at the age of 42, and only her family attended her funeral. So, you see, she was hardly a well-known figure. So, in Pride and Prejudice, we can see glimpses of Austen herself. To sum up, during Austen's lifetime, she didn't achieve fame or wealth through her works, much like the painter Van Gogh. But after her death, her 6 novels have ensured that we remember her even today. In Pride and Prejudice, we can actually see Austen's perspectives and experiences. For instance, Elizabeth, the heroine, has a close friend named Charlotte. Charlotte is originally a smart and sensible girl, but she isn't very attractive, and her family isn't wealthy. So, she uses some cunning and marries the disagreeable Mr. Collins. This was her choice after careful consideration. Charlotte tells Elizabeth, "I am 27 years old. I have no money and no prospects. I am already a burden to my parents." How realistic and helpless is this? Even today, we see such women around us, who, feeling they are getting older and lacking good conditions, get pressured into marriage. Even if there is no love, they see it as a choice for stability. Many women willingly accept such a fate, right? It's still the case today. But there is one person who refuses to accept it, the heroine of the book, Elizabeth. So, what kind of girl is Elizabeth? She is lively and intelligent by nature. But we must note a bitter truth depicted in this book. No matter how rich your inner world is or how wise you are always being chosen by others. To want autonomy in marriage has never been easy, from 200 years ago to now. But the sharp-witted Elizabeth never accepts the arrangements of fate. She knows from start to pursue what she truly wants. She can't accept being trapped in a marriage arranged for her, without ever experiencing love. She wants to control her own life, so she rejects all the suitors who are socially equal to her. This is also a true reflection of Jane Austen's own feelings. We often say marriage is the grave of love, but that's not necessarily true. At least in Pride and Prejudice, it's suggested that a marriage without love is the real grave. So how does Austen arrange Elizabeth's fate? Elizabeth has her imperfections. She isn't breathtakingly beautiful and is very stubborn, holding prejudices against many people. When everyone else is trying hard to please the rich and handsome Mr. Darcy, Elizabeth refuses to lower herself. So, from the initial mutual antagonism due to Pride and Prejudice, they gradually come to understand each other and finally get together, going through a very long process. The story is very captivating, but just when they both realize their feelings for each other, they face strong opposition from Darcy's aunt, a noble woman. When your marriage isn't approved by your parents, what should you do? We immediately think of famous tragedies like the butterfly lovers or the peacock flies to the southeast. But in this book, Elizabeth stands firm. How does she face the criticism? She bravely responds to the noblewoman with these words: "Your nephew is a gentleman, and I am a gentleman's daughter. We are equal. You have no right to interfere in my future." This leaves the other party speechless. This part is very exciting, and we'll discuss it next. A lot of people thought Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth, with their strong personalities, would end up parting ways. But Austen made sure they blossomed into a perfect love story. It shows that Pride and Prejudice are nothing when faced with love. This is Austen's warm and soft side. It's much like the Chinese saying, "May all lovers become spouses." This is the happy marriage model Austen celebrates with Elizabeth and Darcy. Though Austen herself remained single, she shared one thing with Elizabeth. They wouldn't compromise on worldly interests. Through her writing, Austen gained respect. She was true to herself, always emphasizing that a truly equal match lies in spiritual equality. Independence and confidence are a woman's greatest charm. Doesn't this remind you of Jane Eyre? Another woman writer's work, Jane Eyre, also emphasizes equality in love. These novels give women a lot of encouragement, a beacon of hope. We'll discuss Jane Eyre later. From my brief introduction, you might see Austen's precious quality. She held on to a beautiful and reasonable standard. She had no illusions about the reality around her. Reality can be cold and harsh, but she faced it head-on without sugarcoating it. In her books you can see the humor and wit. This is Austen's trait. She was cheerful and very humorous. Some people cry when faced with ugliness and unfairness, but Austen did not. She would smile with understanding and tolerance. She saw society and the world as a comedy with her rational mind. To understand Pride and Prejudice, we need to start with two key words: love and class. Does class obstruct love? The opening sentence of this book is one of the most beautiful in literary history, often used as a writing model. It states a truth. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. Austen uses this line to introduce a bunch of ridiculous characters and a series of humorous events. Let's read a passage. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. However little known the feelings or views of such a man may be on his first entering a neighborhood, this truth is so well fixed in the minds of the surrounding families that he is considered as the rightful property of someone or other of their daughters. So, what happens? a very rich and handsome Mr. Bingley moves into Netherfield Park with his family. In 18th century England, the main social activity was public gatherings where unmarried men and women could meet. When the eligible bachelor Mr. Bingley moves into Netherfield, a ball is immediately arranged. At this ball, all kinds of flirting, subtle probing, and declarations of love take place among the young people. The Bennet family gets excited when they hear about Mr. Bingley's arrival, especially Mrs. Bennet, who has 5 beautiful daughters. She talks to Mr. Bennet about it. Is he married or single? Oh, single, my dear, to be sure. A single man of large fortune, 4,000 or 5,000 a year. What a fine thing for our girls. So, what does 4,000 or 5,000 pounds mean? Back then, an average middle-class income in England was about 1,000 pounds a year, so Mr. Bingley's wealth is 4 to 5 times that of others, which is really impressive. Plus, he's a single man. Mr. Bennet says, "What's it to us? How does that relate to my daughters?" Mrs. Bennet replies, "Oh, Mr. Bennet, you're so annoying. You know I want Mr. Bingley to marry one of our girls." Mr. Bennet isn't really interested and says, "I don't see why it's so important. You and the girls can visit him, or you can go yourself. Since you're just as pretty as they are, maybe Mr. Bingley will end up liking you instead." Mrs. Bennet says, "Oh dear, you're flattering me. I used to be quite a beauty, but now I won't pretend. When a woman has 5 grown-up daughters, she shouldn't be worrying about her looks any more." Mr. Bennet replies, "So, women don't really have much time to think about their looks, do they?" This is classic British humour. Using this as a starting point, the couple talks about their daughters, which gives us a glimpse into them. Among the 5 girls, Mr. Bennet's favourite is the second daughter, Elizabeth, who's nicknamed Lizzie. But Mrs. Bennet doesn't see it that way. She thinks Lizzie is inferior to all the others. I guarantee she's not half as pretty as Jane, her eldest daughter, who is very beautiful. And in terms of character, she's not half as good as Lydia, their youngest daughter, Lydia, who is very flirtatious, attention-seeking, and a bit reckless. Mrs. Bennet says, "You're always biased towards her." Mr. Bennet replies, "None of them are anything special. They're just like other girls, foolish and ignorant, but Lizzie is a bit more clever than her sisters." So, you see, Mr. and Mrs. Bennet are completely different. Mr. Bennet favors his second daughter because she's smart. When Mrs. Bennet hears this, she almost loses it, saying, "You don't understand my poor nerves at all. How can you talk about our daughter like that?" This is Mrs. Bennet's way of showing weakness and complaining. Mr. Bennet says, "You're misunderstanding me, dear. I hold your nerves in the highest regard. They've been my old friends for at least 20 years. It's a resigned complaint, implying she's too nagging." So, we see that Mr. and Mrs. Bennet have very different personalities. Mr. Bennet is eccentric, quick-witted, and enjoys making sarcastic remarks. But he's also reserved, introverted, and likes to do his own thing. Even after 32 years of marriage, Mrs. Bennet still can't quite figure him out. In contrast, Mrs. Bennet is simpler to understand. She's not very bright, narrow-minded, and moody, and she sometimes thinks she has neurasthenia. Her main job in life has been to marry off her daughters. What kind of daughters would such a couple raise? Soon, the 5 Bennet sisters and their friends make their debut at a ball. Why is the ball so important? The book says, "Loving to dance is an essential step in courtship." What does that mean? It reflects a social rule from England at the time, which was how unmarried girls could enter social circles and start the path to romance. They had to officially enter the social scene. In the high society of England back then, unmarried women needed to be accompanied by an older female, like a family member or governess. Also, if there was an older daughter still unmarried, the younger sisters had to follow the rules. No dating, at least not marrying. The aristocratic activities of the time seem pretty limited by today's standards, mainly dancing, hunting, playing chess, or cards. Dancing was the main way for young people to meet. To fit into the local scene quickly, Mr. Bingley's family hosted a ball as soon as they arrived in Netherfield. It's at this ball that Elizabeth first meets Mr. Darcy. Mr. Bingley's family includes 2 sisters, a brother-in-law, and his friend Mr. Darcy. Mr. Bingley is charming, friendly, and down-to-earth. His sisters are elegant and fashionable. His brother-in-law is unremarkable, but Mr. Darcy, his friend, is tall, handsome, and has a noble presence. As soon as Mr. Darcy arrives, he attracts everyone's attention. Within 5 minutes of his arrival, it's already known that Mr. Darcy has an income of £10,000 a year. You see, gossip travels fast. We already knew Mr. Bingley was wealthy, with an income of £4,000 to £5,000 a year, so Mr. Darcy must be even more impressive. Maybe because of his money, people started praising Mr. Darcy as the epitome of a catch. The men admired him, and the women claimed he was even more handsome than Mr. Bingley. For nearly half the evening people looked at him with admiration. He was the toast of the ball. But Mr. Darcy quickly ruined his good impression. Why? His behavior was awful. People found him arrogant and aloof, unable to be pleased by anyone, especially compared to Mr. Bingley. Mr. Bingley quickly mingles with everyone in the ballroom. He is lively, open, and dances with everyone, making him naturally likable. He is friendly to everyone, so people feel valued. But Mr. Darcy is different. He refuses to dance and won't meet new people. According to the social rules of the time, especially when there are more women than men, a well-mannered gentleman should politely and actively invite the ladies to dance. Only by doing so would all the ladies have a chance to dance. That's what makes a gentleman. But Mr. Darcy clearly doesn't care about pleasing others, so everyone decides he is the most arrogant and disagreeable person, hoping he won't come around again. At the ball, Mr. Bingley is instantly smitten with Elizabeth's sister Jane, calling her the most beautiful woman he's ever seen. But Mr. Bingley also tries to get Mr. Darcy to invite Elizabeth to dance, suggesting, "Look at that pretty younger sister over there. She's lovely too. You should meet her." But Mr. Darcy flatly refuses, saying after a glance at Elizabeth, "She's all right, but not pretty enough to make me interested." This deeply offends Elizabeth. People don't like having their appearance criticized, and Elizabeth is no exception. So from this moment, Elizabeth's first impression of Mr. Darcy is established. Prejudice. The worst thing about prejudice is that it creates a rigid system in our minds. Elizabeth believes Mr. Darcy is arrogant and rude, unworthy of respect or trust. This affects her judgment of him, making her unable to think objectively about the complex reality. Instead, she's inclined to believe any bad news about him. So Elizabeth immediately decides Mr. Darcy is very arrogant and selfish, even though she doesn't really know him. Her prejudice against Darcy deepens once again when Elizabeth by chance meets a handsome man named Wickham. At first, Wickham makes a great impression on Elizabeth, even making her slightly infatuated with him. Wickham is not only handsome and cheerful, but also charming and well-spoken, without being overly familiar. But in reality, Wickham is a typical scoundrel, irresponsible and deceitful. He deliberately tarnishes Darcy's reputation by telling Elizabeth that he was close with Darcy's father. He claims that Darcy's father had asked him to look after Wickham, but Darcy ignored his father's wishes and mistreated him. When Elizabeth hears this from Wickham, she believes him without a second thought. That's prejudice. Even when Miss Bingley later tells her that's not true, and the facts are different from what Wickham said, Elizabeth remains unmoved. She firmly believes that Darcy is not only arrogant, but also deceitful and mean. At this point, it's clear that things are getting complicated. Elizabeth's negative impression of Darcy seems hard to undo, and to make matters worse, something happens involving Elizabeth's beloved sister Jane. Since the ball, Jane has been smitten with Mr. Bingley. She'll confide in Elizabeth, just like we do with our close friends. She says, "Young men should be like him." She's talking about Bingley. In public, Jane hides her feelings, but when alone, she's completely open. She describes Bingley as knowledgeable, funny, and lively, saying she's never met anyone as delightful as him, so easygoing and impeccably polite. Elizabeth immediately says, "He's also very handsome. Young men should be good-looking, provided they can make it." Everything seems perfect, and Jane is thrilled. She says, When Bingley asked me to dance for the second time, I was so flattered. I didn't expect him to think so highly of me. Notice how different Jane and Elizabeth are. Jane is gentle, cautious, and good at restraining herself. She's very considerate. Because of this, Bingley doesn't realize Jane's true feelings for him. He even thinks she's not interested, which is what happens when someone is too considerate and ends up causing misunderstandings. Soon after, Elizabeth hears some news from one of Darcy's cousins. During a casual conversation, the cousin mentions that Bingley wanted to pursue Jane further. However, Darcy advised against it, suggesting that they might not be a good match. As a result, Bingley decides to abandon his interest in Jane. You can imagine how furious Elizabeth is, knowing her sister's deep feelings for Bingley. Instead of analyzing what might have caused this and how to resolve it, she blindly concludes that Darcy is the villain. She believes he must be prejudiced against her family's poverty and deliberately sabotage Jane and Bingley's potential engagement, which leaves Jane heartbroken. At this point, Elizabeth's misunderstanding of Darcy is at its peak. But poor Mr. Darcy, the so-called arrogant one, is unaware of this. On the contrary, as he spends time with Elizabeth, he gradually realizes how lively, intelligent, and perceptive she is. He falls in love with her, and unable to contain his feelings, proposes to Elizabeth. The event happens when Elizabeth is ill, and Mr. Darcy comes to visit her, which surprises Elizabeth. Darcy immediately inquires about her health, hoping she feels a bit better. Elizabeth is very cold and formal, because her prejudice has clouded her judgment, and she doesn't like Darcy at all. Darcy's behavior is quite strange. He sits for a few minutes, then starts pacing around the room. Elizabeth is puzzled, but says nothing. After a few minutes of silence, Darcy suddenly, with great emotion, approaches Elizabeth and says, "I've fought against my feelings for so long, but it's been in vain. I can't suppress my emotions any longer. Please allow me to confess how deeply I admire and love you." Elizabeth was stunned, like she'd been hit by lightning, and didn't know how to respond. Darcy, on the other hand, misunderstood her silence for shyness and blush. So he kept going with his proposal. And what did he say? He said, "Even though you're low-born and marrying you would lower my status, and despite the obstacles from your family, I'd rather suffer myself than not marry you." Darcy thought this was a heartfelt confession, but as you can see, this is what a clueless guy sounds like. His words didn't help his proposal at all. While it might have initially flattered Elizabeth to have such an admired man propose to her, Darcy's continued arrogance in his proposal made her extremely angry. Elizabeth firmly said, "No matter how you propose, it's not going to persuade me to accept you." Darcy was taken aback. He hadn't expected that response. So Elizabeth decided to lay it all out. She told Darcy that from the very first time she met him, she felt he was arrogant, selfish, and conceited, with no regard for others' feelings. Her first impression of him was bad, and the subsequent events only reinforced her opinion. She explained about her sister Jane in Wickham, and then said, "I'm convinced that even if you were the last man on earth, I wouldn't marry you." Elizabeth may be stubborn, but she has a strong sense of integrity. She believes that if you treat others poorly and act unfairly, you deserve to be disliked, and she truly does dislike him. Darcy was, of course, thoroughly crushed. His pride and aristocratic arrogance were completely shattered. How did he respond? He said, "You've said enough, miss. I fully understand your feelings, and thinking about how I once had those feelings for you only makes me feel ashamed now. Forgive me for taking up so much of your time, and please allow me to sincerely wish you health and happiness." With that, he turned and left. Even after this scene, I still see Darcy as a gentleman, despite everything. So what happens next? After Darcy angrily leaves, he calms down and writes Elizabeth a letter. This letter is his attempt to clear his name. How can he justify himself to overcome her prejudice? Darcy gathered his courage to propose to Elizabeth, thinking he was offering a sincere heart and expecting her to be moved. But Elizabeth's firm rejection and unfair accusations shocked him. Darcy was very upset, but still showed good manners and kindness. So how do you deal with someone who has a poor first impression of you and holds prejudices? Darcy's next actions are a textbook example of clearing misunderstandings. He writes a long letter starting with, "Miss, please don't be anxious upon receiving this letter. Don't worry that I'm revisiting old issues or pouring out my feelings again or proposing once more, making you feel as disgusted as you did last night. I write this letter with no intention to hurt you or to demean myself. Although I can't easily forget my feelings, for the sake of our mutual happiness, it's best not to bring it up again. So how do we view this letter?" From this brief opening, we see Darcy's rationality. He doesn't let his emotions take over. He first considers Elizabeth's feelings, assuring her not to worry, that he won't propose again, and that he doesn't want to hurt her. But he also doesn't demean himself. Although he still has feelings for her, he's choosing not to mention it again for their mutual happiness. Next, he aims to clarify the facts and explain the misunderstandings, so he simply addresses 2 points. First, about Bingley and Elizabeth's sister Jane. Bingley was very enthusiastic, but Jane, being her naturally reserved self, seemed cold towards him. Darcy, not knowing this as an outsider, acted out of concern for a friend and decided to prevent the match, which had nothing to do with class issues. Second, about Wickham. Darcy describes him as a complete charlatan. Wickham refused to become a clergyman for money, and then tried to elope with Darcy's sister, aiming to get her $30,000 inheritance. Darcy's sincere and unemotional explanation prompts Elizabeth to reconsider the truth. Is Darcy really as selfish, greedy, and malicious as she believed? This letter, with its proper expression, became an opportunity to clear up misunderstandings. Of course, one letter alone isn't enough to change someone's opinion of you, but it does give us a hint. If something isn't as you expected, don't just assume the other person knows. Thinking, "I thought you knew," isn't very objective. You need to explain and present the facts rationally, and do it promptly. Just like Darcy, he wrote a letter to Elizabeth the next day. Soon after, things continued to develop. Elizabeth received an invitation from her aunt to visit a grand estate, which happened to be Darcy's property. She had heard in advance that Darcy wouldn't be there, so she went with peace of mind. While at the estate, she met many people who knew Wickham. Their comments confirmed Darcy's description of him as a fraud, someone who left debts all over the place and relied on Darcy to clear them. This was when Elizabeth began to understand Darcy more fully, and her prejudice started to dissipate. This means that when others have a poor opinion of you, first you should try to explain, and second, you need to rely on your everyday behavior and reputation to gradually change their opinion. It's important to reflect daily on whether your actions and words are correct. Can you fall in love with someone you dislike? There's a line in a Chinese odyssey. Can you love someone you hate? Can you? Can you not? Of course you can. In Pride and Prejudice, Darcy and Elizabeth's love starts to grow after they clear up their misunderstandings. So what is the foundation for this budding affection? It's equal interaction. Remember when Darcy first mustered up the courage to propose to Elizabeth, he mentioned that their social classes were mismatched. This disparity in class signifies inequality between people from different classes. Just how unequal are they? Elizabeth's father, Mr. Bennet, is a country gentleman with an annual income of about $2,000, which is considered a middle-class family income. But with $2,000, he has to support a large family with 5 daughters. Darcy's family, on the other hand, has an annual income of $10,000, which is 5 times that of Mr. Bennet. What does that mean? Historians estimate that at the end of the 18th century, there were only about 400 families in all of Britain with an income of $10,000. So, in the vast land of Britain, only 400 people lived the way Darcy did. And how many of those were single men? Darcy was definitely among the elite of the elite. We see that compared to Mr. Bennet, Darcy is a traditional aristocrat. In England at that time, status could bring a huge sense of superiority. However, Elizabeth, while visiting Darcy's estate, met many of Darcy's servants. She was surprised to find that Darcy didn't treat others with arrogance. He was not only polite and respectful to his servants, but also courteous to the tenants and the poor around him, not putting on airs just because they were common people. So you might wonder, if Darcy is so kind to the poor, why is he so fixated on Elizabeth's social standing? He is indeed very arrogant. When he first encountered this group of modest people, he looked down on them, which led him to interfere with his friend Bingley's relationship with Elizabeth's sister Jane. This arrogance has several layers of causes. First, it's obviously related to wealth. The Bennet family, along with Darcy and Bingley, are in completely different financial leagues. We have to acknowledge that financial compatibility plays a significant role in romantic relationships. The book also features a typical character, Elizabeth's cousin, Mr. Collins. Since Elizabeth's father had no sons, the family estate is to be inherited by a male heir, meaning if Mr. Bennet were to pass away, his 5 daughters would not inherit the estate. Instead, it would go to his nephew, Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins has no shame about inheriting the estate. He sees it as his entitlement. He is a very narrow-minded and dull person. His idea of showing gratitude is to marry one of the Bennet sisters, simply as a way of repaying them. Mr. Collins first set his sights on the eldest and most beautiful sister, Jane, but when he found out she was already taken, he then proposed to the second sister, Elizabeth. After being rejected by Elizabeth, he settled for marrying one of Elizabeth's friends. For Mr. Collins, marriage is just a formality. Who he marries is irrelevant. Elizabeth's friend shares this view, valuing marriage only for the stability and respect it brings, rather than for love or emotional connection. This reflects the book's observation. Romance for some people will never happen. But Darcy and Elizabeth are different from Mr. Collins. They both firmly believe in love and think romance is important. That's why Elizabeth turns down her cousin's proposal, and her father supports her because such a marriage wouldn't bring happiness. Yes, the key word here is happiness. Can pure material wealth bring happiness? It doesn't work that way. Happiness isn't something you can buy. So, how does Darcy see the relationship between class and happiness? For him, material wealth's biggest impact isn't about buying houses, clothes, or handbags, but about education. That's the real reason Darcy looks down on people from modest backgrounds. When Darcy's aunt, an old aristocrat, learned that Elizabeth's family didn't have a governess, she was shocked and said, "Are you all savages?" The lack of a governess and the many children in the Bennet household reflect their true situation. To the aristocracy, the Bennet sisters' social graces are uneven because they were raised in such a barbaric manner. Elizabeth herself has also voiced complaints about her sister's lack of refinement. One time, Elizabeth had a serious conversation with her father, Mr. Bennet, and she expressed her concerns very earnestly. She said, "Sorry, but I have to be straightforward, dear father. If you don't make an effort to control Lydia's wild behavior, Lydia being my youngest sister, she'll keep flirting with officers and will soon be beyond help. Her character will become set, and by the time she's 16, she'll turn into nothing but a disgrace, bringing shame upon herself and our whole family. She'll end up being the worst kind of woman, with nothing to recommend her except her youth and decent looks. Moreover, she's ignorant and foolish, only knowing how to flirt. Doesn't she realize this will only make her look contemptible everywhere? Kitty is at risk too. Whatever Lydia does, she always follows her around. Kitty being their third sister. Vain, ignorant, idle, and uncontrollable. Dear father, think about it. How can they not be despised and scorned everywhere? And how can they not bring shame upon their sister? Elizabeth's words are indeed very sharp. She doesn't hold back in criticizing her sisters, but speaks very truthfully. Because of their misconduct and flirtatious behavior, her sisters cause a lot of trouble, leading Darcy's class to view the Bennet sisters with a certain degree of arrogance, believing they might not be good girls or suitable as wives. After Elizabeth spoke these words, Mr. Bennet lovingly took her hand and said, "Don't trouble yourself, dear. No matter where you and Jane go, people will respect and value you. Even if you have two or maybe three incredibly foolish sisters, it doesn't diminish your virtues." You see, that's how Mr. Bennet treats his daughters. He lets them be and doesn't put much effort into guiding them. That's the peculiar Mr. Bennet. As for Mrs. Bennet, as we know from the beginning, she is very gossipy, shallow, and focused solely on marrying her daughters off to good families, like finding a good home for a valuable item. She doesn't care about their personal growth. Hearing her father's response, Elizabeth had to give up the discussion, but her feelings remained unchanged. She left feeling disappointed and regretful. Fortunately, she wasn't one to dwell on unfortunate situations. She felt she had done her best and wasn't the type to get anxious or make a fuss over unavoidable misfortunes. After this passage, we see the importance of family education. We often hear the saying that girls should be richly raised. What does this mean? It's not about endless material satisfaction, but about spiritual richness. If you read a book with your child, share genuinely wise insights, and experience things together, that can be far more important than buying them a handbag or a pretty dress. This brings us to an important concept: women's education. In the time of Pride and Prejudice, how were women educated? I found some information to share. Around the 18th and 19th centuries, the number of girls' boarding schools in England increased significantly, with tuition fees varying widely from $12 to $100 per year. The curriculum focused mainly on female refinement and included subjects like English, French, geography, history, writing, drawing, dance, and music. Typically, women from lower social classes, especially from merchant families, were particularly eager to send their daughters to receive education. Some families had unrealistic expectations, thinking that education could elevate their daughters to higher social status, hoping that marriage could change their fate. This often led to unfortunate outcomes, with many poorly behaved teachers and classmates causing tragic situations. For someone like Darcy, a nobleman, he also has very specific expectations for his future wife, and that's being talented and accomplished. In the book, Darcy sets out clear standards. Of course, if a person isn't exceptional, they don't qualify as truly accomplished. What does exceptional mean? A woman must have complete knowledge in music, vocal skills, art, dance, and modern languages to earn the title of being truly accomplished. Not only that, her demeanor, her posture, her speech tone, attitude, and choice of words all need to reflect refinement. Otherwise, she doesn't meet the standard. Darcy adds, not only should she have these qualities, but she should also be well-read and knowledgeable, being a person of depth. Reading this, we see that Darcy is quite mature in his feelings. He has very clear expectations for the ideal woman, and the core of these expectations isn't material. It's not about your background or how much money you make each year. What really matters is inner substance. At this point, we realize that, according to these standards, Elizabeth really fits Darcy's expectations. In terms of inner qualities, independence, and wisdom, she matches Darcy equally. What happens next is a significant event that confirms Darcy and Elizabeth's mutual feelings: a scandal. What kind of scandal? Elizabeth's younger sister, Lydia, has eloped with Wickham. How exactly did you fall in love with me? That Elizabeth and Darcy truly opened their hearts to each other, got rid of prejudice, and eliminated pride started with a scandalous elopement. Elizabeth tells Darcy, "I just received a letter from Jane with terrible news. It can't be hidden any longer. My younger sister has run off with someone." And who is this someone? It's that hypocrite Wickham. She's been manipulated by Wickham. They've run away from Brighton together. You know what kind of man he is. You can imagine the rest. My sister, Lydia, has no money or influence, no leverage to make him comply. She's completely ruined. What does elopement mean? Without the security of marriage, the girl's reputation will be destroyed. And if the family can't support her, her situation will be dire. So everyone sees a heavy shadow looming over them, and the entire family will be shamed by Lydia's actions. How does Darcy react? He looks at Elizabeth's distress and seems overwhelmed with panic, almost unsure of how to respond. Darcy, with a tone of sympathy and restraint, says, "I'm afraid you must want me to leave, and I have no reason to ask you to let me stay, but I genuinely care about you. Even though my concern is of no use, heaven help me, I want to say something or do something to ease my own pain for you. But I don't want to just say comforting words and give you false hope, as if I'm trying to earn your gratitude." When Darcy says this, it sounds like diplomatic rhetoric. What is he really trying to say? Essentially, he means that no matter how well he speaks, it doesn't help. He deeply wants to do something for you, but he hasn't done anything yet. So what can he say? It sounds convoluted, but then Darcy, putting aside past grievances, puts in effort and money. First, he painstakingly finds out where Lydia and Wickham are staying after their elopement. Next, he negotiates with Wickham, the man he detests and never want to see again, and privately gives Wickham a large sum of money in return for a promise from Wickham to marry Lydia. Darcy single-handedly facilitated Lydia and Wickham's marriage, preventing the scandal from spreading and saving the Bennet family from disgrace. Throughout this process, Darcy never revealed a word to Elizabeth, which is a very noble act. He entrusted Elizabeth's uncle to handle the matter, with his uncle writing a letter and managing everything publicly. Even Mr. Bennet questioned, "Good heavens, if Wickham is so base, he wouldn't have married Lydia without at least 10,000. How did your uncle manage to give him so much money, and how will we repay it?" It wasn't until things reached this point that someone quietly revealed to Elizabeth what Darcy had actually done. Darcy, with his noble character and genuine actions, won Elizabeth's affection. The prejudices between them dissolved completely, and Elizabeth realized that she had fallen in love with Darcy. So, is the story sweet and perfect from here? Of course not. Before a perfect ending, they face a test that many people encounter when in love or entering marriage. How do the parents view it? If there's opposition, how do you handle it? It happens on a happy day. Bingley and Jane are engaged, and everyone is thrilled. But then an unexpected visitor arrives. Who is it? Darcy's aunt, the matriarch of an aristocratic family, who has come to oppose the relationship between Elizabeth and Darcy. What impact can such external interference have on love? Think about Jia Baoyu and Lin Daiyu, or The Peacock Flies Southeast. We will understand it's a powerful shadow, right? But Elizabeth is not deterred. She dares to fight back, and her resistance is remarkable. Let me read it to you. Since Lydia and Wickham's scandal didn't turn into a scandal but led to marriage, and Jane has successfully married the eligible Bingley, the Bennet family has suddenly become one of the luckiest families around. Just a few weeks ago, when Lydia ran away from home, everyone said the family was cursed. Have you found out? It's amazing how powerful gossip can be. It can ruin lives without a trace of bloodshed. If you get trapped in other people's opinions, life becomes unbearable. And now, Elizabeth faces the brunt of this gossip. Darcy's aunt, Lady Catherine, a noblewoman, comes specifically to see Elizabeth. She invites her for a walk and a chat, but really, it's because she's heard that her nephew Darcy might be in love with Elizabeth. She's come to express her opposition directly. She says, 2 days ago I heard the most shocking news. It's said that not only is your sister about to make a great match, but also that you, Miss Elizabeth Bennet, might soon be engaged to my nephew, Mr. Darcy. She thinks the sister is just climbing up the social ladder, and she despises the Bennets with all her heart. I know this must be a vile rumor, and I would never think less of him, but I've decided to come and make my views clear to you. Lady Catherine starts by saying that no matter what Darcy has done, he is her nephew, a noble gentleman, and she would never think less of him. But she's come to warn Elizabeth. Elizabeth is shocked, her face flushed, feeling both humiliated and offended. She replies, "I find it strange that you've gone to such lengths to come here. What exactly are you trying to say?" Lady Catherine immediately responds, "As long as he's in his right mind, it's impossible. But if you've used your charms to entice him, he might be temporarily infatuated with you and forget his responsibilities to himself and his family. Perhaps you've seduced him." We often hear such accusations, but Elizabeth retorts, "If I had really seduced him, I certainly wouldn't tell you." "Miss Bennet, do you know who I am? I don't like being spoken to like this. I am probably the closest person to Darcy in this world, and I have the right to be involved in his personal matters. So, if you were Elizabeth, what would you do?" Elizabeth responds, "You have no right to know my affairs, and with your approach, don't expect me to reveal anything. She is so tough." Lady Catherine continues, "Let me be clear. You are obsessed with this marriage, but it's impossible, absolutely impossible. Mr. Darcy is engaged to my daughter. What else do you have to say?" The killer blow is that Elizabeth shouldn't try to entice Darcy. He has his ideal match, and they're already engaged. If Elizabeth tries to intervene, she's being immoral. Elizabeth says, "Let me just say this. If Darcy is truly engaged to your daughter, then you have no reason to think he would propose to me." This is a great counter, suggesting that if Darcy is already engaged to her daughter, how could he possibly propose to Elizabeth? How could a morally upstanding person act in such a way? Thus Lady Catherine's claims are false, and she hesitates, having been exposed. She then says, "Whether it's a matter of prestige, propriety, decorum, no, practical interests, none of it involves feelings," she emphasizes. "Yes, Miss Bennet, it's practical interests. You should not expect Darcy's family and friends to accept you. Anyone associated with him will condemn, look down on, and ignore you, and your union will become a disgrace. Even your name will be erased from our conversations." Such a love, beset by criticism and opposition, faces tremendous pressure. And this is not just pressure, it's an undeniable reality. So is Elizabeth afraid? Elizabeth replies, "It is truly dreadful." Indeed, to be erased from mention and cast out of their social circle leads to social death. However, what matters is however. She says, however, whoever becomes Mr. Darcy's wife and gains a noble status will certainly enjoy great happiness. So on the whole, it's not a loss. What does Elizabeth express? "As long as it's true love, we can withstand the test. I deserve the noble status, respect, and all the blessings that come with love, so what's the loss? You people have nothing to do with me. Are you the ones in love? Are you the ones getting married? Are you the ones who will spend your life with Mr. Darcy?" Though her words are brief, they are powerful and profound. For those who fight for love and claim their rights, this statement is worth memorizing and repeating. Why not tell those dissenters to be quiet? This is my love, my life. Elizabeth's firm resistance leaves Lady Catherine powerless. Lady Catherine says that Elizabeth is not a match for their family and is from a different social class, so she will not be blessed. Elizabeth is not at all self-deprecating. She says, "Marrying your nephew won't elevate me beyond my current social standing. He is a gentleman, and I am the daughter of a gentleman. We are well matched." See, she has no shadow of doubt. Hearing this, Lady Catherine is nearly apoplectic. She realizes that, although Elizabeth and Darcy are not yet engaged, she cannot sway either of them. She tries one last time, asking, "Can you promise me that you will never be engaged to Mr. Darcy?" Elizabeth responds, "I cannot make such a promise. I absolutely will not give you any assurance. Your threats are useless. I won't agree to such unreasonable demands. Even if I gave you the promise you want, would that make them marry? If Darcy loves me and I refuse him, would he turn to love his cousin instead? Madam, frankly, your demands are irrational and foolish. You've completely misunderstood my character, thinking you can bully me with sophistry. You have no right to interfere in my personal affairs. Elizabeth's response is full of dignity. Lady Catherine says, "Very well, it seems you refuse to listen to me." The "very well" clearly means that she is extremely annoyed. I want you to consider responsibility, reputation, and gratitude, yet you refuse. You're determined to ruin his reputation among his friends and family and make him a laughingstock. This is the last straw for many people. The opposition often comes from self-interest, masked as concern for your well-being. Even if you refuse to accept this so-called good, aren't you thinking about him? If he marries you, how will it affect him? Some people are scared. Elizabeth should be admired for her response. The current situation has nothing to do with responsibility, reputation, or gratitude. Don't try to put labels on me. Marrying Mr. Darcy does not violate any principle. As for his relatives, if they resent him for marrying me, I won't care for a second. And as for people who think less of him, I believe most people will be reasonable and not look down on him. Wisdom is incredibly important, and reading is equally vital. Even when we feel weak, overwhelmed, or unsure of what to do, classic books have already pointed out the direction and methods for achieving happiness. Despite Elizabeth's firm resistance to the interference in her feelings, she remains distressed and unsettled. Learning about his aunt's visit to Elizabeth and her response makes Darcy ecstatic and relieved, for he realizes that Elizabeth does not dislike him and even loves him. One person no longer harbors arrogance, and the other has shed prejudice. At this point, they begin to view each other as equals. But what is love? Love can make those involved better people. When this pair of lovers decide to be together, they first reflect on their own flaws. Darcy says, "I've been selfish all my life. Although selfishness is not my personal creed, I've been quite self-centered. I learned right from wrong as a child, but no one taught me how to correct my temper. I was allowed to practice these lessons with arrogance. Unfortunately, being an only child, I was spoiled by my parents. From age 8 to 28, if it weren't for meeting you, my dearest and most beloved Elizabeth, I wouldn't have learned this lesson. Your rebuke was hard to bear at first, but it has been immensely beneficial. You were right to criticize me. When I proposed to you, I thought you would surely accept. However, you made me realize that my pretentious demeanor would never win the affection of someone truly worthy." Darcy reflects on his arrogance. And what about Alicia's eye? Elizabeth reflects on herself as well. She returns to her optimistic and playful state and asks Darcy, "Tell me how you came to love me. How did it all begin? I know once you started, it naturally progressed, but how did you take the first step?" Darcy replies, "I can't pinpoint the exact moment or place, whether it was your appearance or something you said that planted the seed of love in my heart. This is love that arises unknowingly and deepens profoundly, much like the lines from the Peony Pavilion, which we will also discuss in the future." He adds, "The time has been so long that I didn't even realize how I fell in love with you." Elizabeth then reflects on her own prejudices and says, "You used to dislike my appearance, and my actions and attitude towards you, even when viewed kindly, weren't very polite." Yes, these were Elizabeth's flaws. "Moreover, every time we spoke, I often made you uncomfortable. Honestly, did you love me for my faults?" At this moment, she is apologizing to Darcy, acknowledging her own problem. Darcy says, "What I love is your vibrant heart." What is a vibrant heart? In the film Pride and Prejudice, at the very end, as Darcy approaches in the morning light, his face gradually becomes clearer, and you know, wow, your heart is racing. This moment in the film has captivated countless hearts. But what is a vibrant heart? It's what Darcy said in his first proposal to Elizabeth. I love you despite societal views, family expectations, and the differences in our social standing. This is a deeply moving confession. Much like the phrase on our cover, I will always be true to myself and running towards you day and night. Finally, we must consider, did the union of Darcy and Elizabeth truly break through class barriers and constraints? Think about it. My answer is no. They represent a perfect match in terms of social standing. Firstly, they belong to the same class, the gentry, but with varying incomes. Notice that even though Mr. Bennet is not particularly wealthy, Elizabeth has a study. Mr. Bennet has many books, and Elizabeth is someone who loves reading, is very intelligent, and values spiritual growth. This is where Darcy and Elizabeth align. They are of the same kind of people, sharing common spiritual pursuits. Although the Bennets could not afford private tutors for their children, and they grew up rather wild, Elizabeth, in contrast, is well-read, insightful, and wise. Mr. Bennet understands this, and firmly believes that no ordinary person is worthy of his outstanding second daughter. Therefore, he encourages her to pursue true happiness rather than an empty marriage. When Elizabeth realizes that Darcy is her true love, she tells her father that she and Darcy are alike in their unwavering commitment to their beliefs. Once they have committed to each other, they do not change. Thus, it is satisfying to see that Darcy and Elizabeth's union is not about appearance, age, or wealth, nor is it about overcoming misunderstandings. They are perfectly matched, both materially and spiritually. Elizabeth has, through her extensive reading, strong opinions, and clear thinking, developed herself into a spiritual aristocrat, making her worthy of the wealthy and handsome Darcy. And here we finally return to the most touching aspect of the book. It is not just a love story, it is about the personal growth achieved through love. This is likely the true reason why Pride and Prejudice has been so universally beloved for so many years.